I'm Victor Polino.
And I'm Christopher Nottingham.
You're listening to Civil Dissonance,
a show where we explore, engage, and dissect the topics that divide us as a society. Today on Civil Dissonance,
we'll be discussing the Fairness Doctrine. Man, Chris, I am so sick and tired turning on the news and just feel like I'm only getting half of the story.
Yeah, me too.
It just boggles my mind. It's like, come on, if we could just get a little more out of this. And I just felt like, what could there possibly be to make a better news program?
Maybe hearing both sides of the story?
What? Both sides of the story, you say?
Well, maybe both sides of the story and both sides are knowledgeable persons.
Have you ever heard of the Fairness Doctrine?
I have.
You have? Can you tell us a little about it?
I can't.
You can't?
Can you?
I can tell you a little bit about it, but not a whole lot. It used to be, back in the olden times, there was a FCC policy that if you presented a story on broadcast media, you had to give the opposing view a chance to speak their mind.
Okay.
You think about it. So if you're watching, Fox News or what you consider conservative or, CNN, which is considered liberal media, you feel like, are they telling me everything I need to know about the story? And what you would get is you get this sort of one-sided perspective, and it's creating this closed-minded environment. And they used to have a policy in place that said, you can't do that. You have to let somebody else speak.
Okay. I would be interested in that.
So, I got to wonder, can we institute something like that again? Do you think we can open our minds and allow for other perspectives to come in?
Well, I tell you, it would be nice to not have to go to different news outlets, news channels to get what I might believe to be the whole story. Because it's really difficult when I know that these networks are pushing their own agendas. It's really hard to know if I'm getting the truth, if I'm getting all the facts. So if there was something that forced the broadcasters, the news outlets, to give me both sides of the story, that would be ideal, I think.
Unfortunately, a few years ago, the last bit of the Fairness Doctrine was finally stricken from the records of the FCC guidelines. Since then, it feels like, well, even before then, it feels like we've just been in this downward spiral of closed-mindedness.
Was that during the Bush administration?
Actually, it was during the Obama administration. The last of it was stricken. From what I remember, Reagan was the initial person to do away with it. So it's not something that's been selected to just one side of the political spectrum. This is something that's kind of been from all over the place.
So this has been gone since the 80s?
Since the 80s was when it was officially done away with. Finally finalized during the Obama administration. But we're going to have a guest, and that guest is going to speak to us about the Fairness Doctrine and hopefully enlighten us. Yes, our guest today is Juanita Frankie Clogston. Dr. Clogston received her PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University in 2014, where her research focused on changes in the media environment, including the decline of newspapers. She previously worked as a journalist for television network news and news agency outlets such as Reuters, McLaughlin Group, and on NBC and ABC News. Currently, she conducts policy and economic research in Washington, D.C.
Interesting.
Yes. I can't wait. You're going to love to hear this. I'm here today with Dr. Juanita Frankie Clogston, writer of the paper The Repeal of the Fairness Doctrine and the Irony of Talk Radio, a story of entrepreneurship, risk, and cover. How are you doing today, Frankie?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's nice to talk with you, Victor.
Well, thank you. I was wanting to know if you could just tell us a little about yourself, what your background is, where you come from, what you do.
Sure, I'd be happy to do so. I am local to the Washington, D.C. area, and thus have been an avid follower of politics for many years. I'm currently working as an economist. I previously worked as a journalist covering politics, and my PhD is in political science, and that was kind of the synergy of having covered politics for so many years. While I was doing that dissertation, I got interested in the topic of the Fairness Doctrine. It was actually because I was interested in conservative politics and how conservative talk radio had been just one of the many motivators of the conservative movement in the late 80s, in the 80s. So I presented that paper at the Policy History Conference. That was in Columbus, and that was quite a while ago. That was probably in 2010 or 11, and these things take a while to get into publication. And, it's really exciting now that there's been some attention. We just had that 30th anniversary of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, and people have reached out to me to get my reaction on that. And so I've been happy to do that and to talk with you today.
We're very interested and excited about it. I mean, when we were looking through for people to interview on the subject, you popped up right there, and the Fairness Doctrine is an interesting piece in that it keeps coming back up. It's it just seems like a couple years ago it emerged again. I think when the Zappel Doctrine, I think is what it was, one way, and I remember seeing it pop up then, and it just seems like every now and then it emerges again in our culture. And I was wondering, what do you think is so enticing about it that draws people into it?
Well, I think, every now and then there's just exasperation. In the last decade, it was from the Democrats, and it was because they felt that there was just no way for them to respond to some of the voices on the right. And so they looked at the Fairness Doctrine as some sort of a balancing mechanism. We're also in an era now where everybody knows about truthiness and about, falsehoods, supposed falsehoods that are on the air. And really that, you're in an environment where people can make a lot of claims that might not be substantiated. And in an era like the Fairness Doctrine, you were mandated, you were required to have an opposing point of view that acted as a check on that. And now you don't have that in the environment. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why the Fairness Doctrine is something people are nostalgic about, if not downright serious about bringing back.
Can you elaborate on the Fairness Doctrine for us? I mean, a lot of our audiences might not have heard of it before. So if you give us just like a general concept or the general concepts of what's covered by it, and maybe a little bit of history.
Sure. The Fairness Doctrine is a policy of the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. And it was enacted in 1949, and it was further codified by Congress in 1957, and basically established that in the name of the quote-unquote public interest, that if you had one point of view or opinion expressed on the air, and this is restricted to radio and television, not newspaper, which actually is not subject to this. But in any case, if you had one point of view on the airwaves, then you were obligated to put on the air the opposing point of view. So that might mean that if you have somebody in favor of nuclear power plant, then you have to put on the opposing point of view. And this was something that was active and in effect until 1987, at which time it was repealed. And the repeal happened after President Reagan came in, and there were forces of, for deregulation, as well as a growing chorus of people saying that really this was impinging upon free speech, as well as more people saying that there's just not the need for it now that there was in 1949. And that's because maybe back in 1949, you only had 3 main television news networks or outlets, and it was important that you have balance on those limited outlets. But now we're in an environment where there are multiple channels on the radio as well as on the television, and so anybody can just turn the dial and find a different point of view, so that's no longer necessary. So that's why there was clamor, starting in the 1980s in particular, to repeal the Fairness Doctrine. Indeed, that's what happened. It's kind of an interesting story we can perhaps get to in a follow-up as to how it was repealed. But after it was repealed, that's when we saw the rise of conservative talk radio, because it was now not an obligation to put an opposing point of view on the air.
How do you think that people are able to get a fair and balanced point of view? I'm assuming what you were saying is that they could just search out the opposing view, but do you think that people tend to do that?
Are you talking about in the prior environment or
in today's environment, as far as a consequence of it? I'm sorry.
Right, I understand what you mean. Certainly, in today's environment, you have the information out there. You have the conservative point of view. You have the liberal point of view. You can switch the dial and you can find those different points of view. And so that was an argument for why we didn't need the Fairness Doctrine. But, of course, what was not foreseen was the tendency, which people were going to demonstrate, to really stick to their own lane. That is to say, we are in kind of a narrowcast environment where people will only watch Fox News, they'll stay in that echo chamber, or they'll only watch MSNBC, they'll stay in that echo chamber. And so you're right. People are not always seeking out both sides.
I know that your focus of your paper was the journey of the repeal of the doctrine. What were some of the strange dynamics that emerged during the process? I know like some Republicans actually opposed the repeal while Reagan supported it. So, I mean, could you elaborate on some of that for us?
That's right. If you were to apply 2020 hindsight, you might say that it's a slam dunk case, and clearly the Republicans should have been for the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. But in fact, that wasn't the case. There were lots of Republicans who felt that they actually were in the minority in terms of getting their point of view expressed on the air, and that was partial reaction to the quote-unquote big three television networks. And they said, without the Fairness Doctrine, the big three networks will just broadcast their point of view, and we won't get on the air. So you had a lot of Republicans that were quite prominent, even within the White House. You know, President Reagan, because he was a believer in deregulation and free speech, he was for the repeal, but he was the minority in his party. He actually had to veto legislation that sought to codify and maintain the Fairness Doctrine. He actually had to go against several in his own party. And Trent Lott, Newt Gingrich, they were, for example, supporters of keeping the Fairness Doctrine alive.
Interesting.
And on the other side, you did have like Bob Packwood. I spoke with him about this, and he called it the Fairness Doctrine at the time because he was a fierce believer in free speech, and he even started a foundation in order to repeal it.
Do you see regulations of this is a regulation on the media, the Fairness Doctrine? Would you have seen it as like a negative regulation, or do you think it might have had some positive influences as well? I mean, I guess one of the things that we're sort of, batting around is any government regulation on the media acceptable? And this was a form of regulation. That's
correct. I, however, approach it more from a free speech point of view. So I do have a problem with the regulation on the media. It's interesting because, in all the instances in the almost 40 years of the Fairness Doctrine, only one license was repealed, and it was Carl McIntyre, who had a show, the 20th Century Reformation Hour. It was broadcast on hundreds of Christian channels around the country, and some actually did call it the hate club because they said that there was a lot of prejudice, really, that was displayed, vitriolic speech against certain groups. So there's the question of, should that kind of free speech be allowed? That might fall into a different kind of category in terms of regulation. But I think unless it's defaming somebody's character or libel or, otherwise covered by some of the existing laws that we have, I'm generally not in favor of trying to regulate the media. Furthermore, it's rather impractical and quite expensive. You would be monitoring hours and hours and hours of airtime, in order to find violations, certainly if you had the Fairness Doctrine. And that's why it was really rarely enforced. As I said, only one license was revoked over 40 years.
That's actually pretty amazing. I mean, only one that could be pointed out, and that was in the lower end where there was only like a handful of outlets, broadcasting stations and things. When was that? I mean, it would just be so much more impossible today, right? Is that kind of what you're saying now versus then?
Yeah, even then you had a couple thousand. You had like 2,500 radio stations in 1949, wow. And you had about 10,000. I just remember this because it went about fourfold to about 1985, about the time of the repeal. So it was impractical even at that time, but yes, it's even more so impractical now. And that's talking about radio. And, television has also increased manyfold. So it's just downright impractical to try to think about enforcing the Fairness Doctrine, as attractive as it might be, as one way to bring back balance.
Is there any parts of the Fairness Doctrine that you feel would have been a positive influence carrying forward? Or, any aspects of it that we could, institute that would still be not infringe, but help to balance people's negative feelings towards the media?
Yeah, I really like the principle of equal time, and that was equal time was a phrase that came from Congress's language when it modified the Communications Act and weighed in on the Fairness Doctrine in 1959. Equal time is important. I don't think you should legislate it, but I'm certainly hoping that the public will have some demand for it in the future. And, you've seen that in the past. I used to enjoy the programs like Crossfire, and I mean, I was a writer on the McLaughlin Group briefly. I've also worked for the major television news networks, NBC and ABC. You know, that some of the talk show formats, they try to bring in opposing points of view into the same room. And I would hope that there would be an interest in that and that we will see more and more of that. Perhaps this will run its course, this echo chamber effect. I mean, media is also a reflection of, I think everybody nowadays often talks about how the public discourse we have now and the polarization we have now is a result of the media. But, you know, who's to say which way the arrows go? It could also be that the media is a reaction to the polarization that we have in the country and a lack of a unifying candidate and, you know, economic hard times that are fueling polarization and finger pointing right now. I would like to think that when the political forces change and there's more unity in the country, you'll see the media change. You know, let's not blame it all on the media.
No, it's, you know, everybody has their hand in it. I would think, you know, that we're all, you know, that's part of what civil dissonance is about, is we want to open the dialogues and just try to get a view of all the different aspects of society and the things that we disagree on and how we can connect. And, you know, to solely blame the media, you know, I don't know. I when you mentioned economics, that's actually something that I was curious about, was the larger broadcasters now, they deal so much big business. Do you think that has an influence then on the dynamic of what a broadcasting company chooses as their content?
I think that it probably does. You know, as I think through this, I'll just mention that big companies like Mobile, for example, were supporters of of keeping the Fairness Doctrine, and they felt that it was a way that they could make sure they had some defense on television. So they did actually feel that the television networks and the radio were from time to time going after them, and somehow that the Fairness Doctrine allowed them the ability to get on the air. I mean, I was down at the archives of the FCC going through these letters that they wrote, Mobile, GM, other major corporations, along with Phyllis Schlafly and Ralph Nader, and like I said, Trent Lott. I mean, it was just kind of fascinating. I think that really, you know, just speaking strictly, kind of limiting our conversation to television and radio, well, and especially just talking about television and the networks that I know most, they don't spend very much time really on looking at corporations, looking at business practices and corporate practices, and a lot of that is just due to how much they're cutting their investigative units. So much of so-called business news is really just monitoring the markets. Frankly, just so much as political news is horse race politics. You know, you're just watching the Dow go up and down. You're just watching poll numbers go up and down. So there's just a lack of investigative, truth-seeking journalism in general.
So you think there's sort of a death of good journalism that's sort of as a result of a lot of this?
I think there's a lot of good journalists out there that are still fighting the fight. And actually, if you look right now at the newspaper war happening between the New York Times and the Washington Post, trying to break stories about the Russia investigation, and likewise, you see that there's still news quality. And I used to be a defender even of NBC News where I worked, because there were such hardworking people there in the business. It's just that they had limited resources. And you're right. I mean, it was a money-making venture, so that they were trying to repurpose every report across multiple mediums. So if they delivered the report on television news, it also had to be put into a blog and also had to be put on the sister cable network. Certainly the bottom line is affecting the quality of news.
Kind of an oversaturation of their resources, reaching out to different things.
That's right, yeah.
Do you, I know in your paper, the title of your paper, you call talk radio as irony. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Oh, I just call it an irony because the majority of Republicans, like I said, as witnessed by the number of votes in the House and Senate, the majority of Republicans were against the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, and in the end, the repeal turned out to be of great benefit to them if you look at how the talk radio took off. And it's interesting that talk radio did take off, by the way, because it actually might say something about where the media was and who it was representing, and then who it represented after the repeal. Apparently, you know, there was one commissioner, FCC commissioner who I talked to, who talked about pent-up demand. And in fact, after the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, it was conservative broadcasters who got on the air and reached wide audiences. So you might ask the question, gee, were the existing three, television networks more liberal? Was the existing radio establishment more liberal? I mean, everybody likes to say the media establishment's more liberal. Maybe it was, because when the Fairness Doctrine was lifted, you saw what I've heard called the quote-unquote pent-up demand, and you saw talk radio take off. So, and I guess that's the irony is, however, they didn't see it coming. They had no idea that they were going to be such great beneficiaries of it.
Yeah, they seem to inherit a whole platform that I don't know that the liberal side would have, at least that I have seen, were able to seize it. Have you seen the liberal market be able to venture out like that?
I really haven't. And there are some that would say, well, that's because the media already is liberal. Certainly there's like Pacifica Radio, and I mean, there are some outlets out there, and I guess there really just isn't as much of a demand because you already have multiple choices.
Okay, so what do you feel is the overarching effects of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine? How do you think that its legacy has laid out since today and maybe in the future?
I think that the legacy of the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine is really just to unleash a lot of free speech, which had previously been unbridled because television and radio stations couldn't afford and were afraid to air things because they couldn't always find the opposing point of view and they had limited resources to do so. So there was a stifled environment, and the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine means you have more free speech. However, what people did not understand was that perhaps there was pent-up demand more for conservative speech because the existing speech that was on the airwaves was generated by perhaps a more liberal media establishment. And even if you don't accept that premise, for whatever reason, what happened is you had more conservative voices and you had an audience that became captive to those conservative audiences. At the same time, you have an explosion of satellite radio, and you just have a media environment which has been called, say, by Marcus Pryor, who's a well-known political scientist, a high-choice environment. And people are just now in their own zones, and you have polarization in terms of media consumption.
Do you think there's any way of opening that dialogue again, or at least opening a dialogue between the two?
I think that you have to just, really it starts with education, which is a more neutral zone, where we can learn about civics and we can learn about politics in a nonpartisan environment. And as I said, I do actually believe that the political environment drives the polarization in media, and it's not just the media driving the polarization in the political environment. So I think if we keep educating young people about politics, they'll perhaps evolve to form points of view that are not in such narrow zones.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you. With the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, there's different paths that have emerged. And one of the things we're trying to get is just your insight. Conversations about education are, I think, imperative.
That's the other way that people find out about politics, right?
Yeah.
If not, before they find out about it in the media, they're educated about politics. So if we can educate them to be open-minded, then hopefully they'll do a better job digesting media.
So how do we get them to engage in that dialogue?
I think that we need to keep emphasizing the value of civic education and the value of journalism. Right now journalism is getting such a bad rap, and I want young people who are going to school, going to high school, to feel really good about their school newspaper or the public or the video newscast that their school puts out, and feel that journalism can be a positive force. And I want them to participate in journalism with excitement, the way that I did, and feel that it's a positive force and it can be educational and provide different points of view. Through that process, they might learn to produce and consume media in a way that's more balanced and takes into account all its sides. But we have disparaged media. It's not an environment, I think, right now. Certainly, people are not going to journalism school because they feel that it's not a valued field, or they feel that if they do go to journalism school, they have to do social media. And, we need to elevate journalism because it deserves a higher status. It's an additional branch of government, really. Alongside journalism, we need to elevate the importance of government and civic education in schools. There's frankly a lot of emphasis on STEM and other kinds of education, but we need to keep educating children about government. That's domestic government as well as our place in the world. And I think if we can educate children in a politically neutral environment about government and also give them avenues to produce and explore and consume media on their own, then perhaps there'll be a more positive viewpoint moving forward in the next generation when it comes to the production and consumption of media.
Do you worry that the name fake news that's been thrown around is having the negative impact on media?
Absolutely. That's what I mean by the way that media is being disparaged. There are some that literally believe that. They believe that it's not credible. And then there are others that believe that media really can't have an effect now. I think have come to believe what you and I are having a dialogue about, which is very problematic for media to reach those outside its own echo chamber. You know, it's really sad right now, but there's quite a pall over media.
When the doctrine was being repealed, what was the media's voice, or did they have a voice in that fight?
That's an interesting point of view. I remember reading some pieces from ABC and from a couple of the major networks, and they actually were concerned that the FCC did not have the ability to repeal the doctrine because it had been codified by Congress and it needed to be overturned by an act of Congress. I think that it's possible they just wanted to make sure that there was real stability. You know, if there was going to be a change in communications policy, that it was going to be done at the appropriate level. But I can't say that for sure. I can certainly say for sure because I would have recalled that they didn't come out strongly in favor of it or against it. I think that would have shown bias or favoritism really on their part, that they either only wanted to keep things so-called balanced, and there would be reasons for some networks to maybe want to do that, knowing that they had the ability to do that when smaller outlets did not, or that they wanted to say, please go ahead and repeal the Fairness Doctrine, because that might give the appearance that they no longer believed in balanced programming.
That was incredible. Very informative. So I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Frankie Clogston, for her time on our show. Thank you so much for being here with Civil Dissonance.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Victor.
Thank you.
If you like what you hear, you can help us out by funding our efforts and keeping the show ad-free.
You can do that by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/civildissonance or by following the link on our website and in the show notes.
You can also show support to our guests by purchasing their books and other works. You can find a list with links on our website under Guest Works.
That was incredible. I think Frankie was an amazing guest. And I have to say that I came out of this with an entirely different perspective than I thought I would have.
I agree.
I actually don't like to say this, but I was in support of the Fairness Doctrine when I came into it. And now I kind of feel opposed to it.
Well, she made some compelling arguments.
It sounds like a dream come true, but I just don't think it could be realized. You know, because in all honesty, it's a censorship.
Yeah, it is a censorship.
Yeah, I think if we do this, it's any type of censorship on the media should be frowned upon because it can lead to something else.
Yeah, and I believe with the Reagan administration giving First Amendment rights to broadcast stations, imposing this is a violation of the First Amendment.
Oh, definitely. Right now we have this closed-minded media, this closed-in media. It's interesting to me because she referred to it as echo chambers. Remember that?
Echo chambers.
Yeah. But if you did the Fairness Doctrine, I think it does the same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the issues that she had mentioned, one of the arguments against the Fairness Doctrine was broadcast stations couldn't actually report on everything that was of public interest because sometimes they just couldn't find an opposing view, or the opposing viewpoint was somebody that they didn't want to air, so they just wouldn't do the story. So that way they wouldn't get pegged by the Fairness Doctrine. And I think, actually, Victor, we're going to run into that a lot with this podcast.
Yeah, I think, well, actually, where we ran into this with this episode, it's, you know, we tried to find another person who could answer the call to this, and we couldn't find someone. one of the other things that arose is we created so many alternate channels with this. It benefited the conservative radio and conservative media a lot more, but, that's all part of it. We're just going to have to search for a way to be informed. I mean, that was the whole point of this podcast, was to make ourselves informed about different issues. And I think we just got a hard lesson in that policy because of it.
Oh, yeah. Now, I do know from doing research that a lot of other countries, especially European countries, and I know Canada has a version of the Fairness Doctrine that they still utilize. In my research, I started looking up, news broadcasts from other countries. And when they have to find the opposing view of certain issues, sometimes those opposing views aren't really that
informed, valid.
They're not really the kind of person that you would want to represent your side of the argument. I feel this way sometimes with, our American news outlets when they try to be fair and balanced and they attempt to have somebody of the opposing view. Sometimes that opposing view, they seem so ill-informed. It's a little embarrassing sometimes, I think.
You think it might be the extreme effort, where the only guy you're hearing is the extremist?
And it could be. It might not be anything that they're doing on purpose. It might be that, somebody who is a knowledgeable person of the opposing view just doesn't want to talk, just doesn't want to do the interview.
We reached out to a few different people and we didn't hear anything back from our guest, or we did hear back and we just couldn't connect in time.
One of the things that she did talk about, and I think was very important, was holding broadcasters accountable. So instead of having something like the Fairness Doctrine where we have the government telling us or having a policy in place that forces broadcasters to give us both sides, I think we as the people, we as the consumers of the media, have to hold our media outlets, our news sources accountable to give us all the facts and to give us both sides.
Especially when the media today, at least the large media that we are most bombarded with, they're businesses. That was part of, I think, of what was going on with the Fairness Doctrine from both the Democrats and the Republicans as they were pushing it away, was they wanted to open up media to let the business side take over. And of course, the downside of that is that we start speaking to agendas. And I think those agendas are clogging us up. So we have to learn to investigate further into that. And if that's the way it's going to be, if we're just going to be bombarded by these larger media outlets, then we have to hold them accountable. We the people.
We're getting news from everywhere now. It's not just CNN. It's not just NBC, ABC, Fox News. Late night television is now reporting news, and they're doing a decent job of getting the facts, even though it's in a humorous manner, and it might lean toward the left or the right according to who you're watching, but that's everywhere. Everywhere has their own agendas. Nobody, I believe, is being completely fair and balanced.
I think Frankie referred to the truthiness from the Colbert Report.
Yeah.
Infotainment, I think, is what is one of the other terms.
Yeah, that refers to the late night comedy shows. But I think you can apply it to the major networks now. I mean, they definitely are looking for ratings. It is entertainment. It's not just to give us the facts. Whenever I watch CNN or Fox News, they spend so much time on one topic and they just keep repeating themselves over and over and over. And you would think with 24-hour news, they would give us more news, more facts. I know there's more going on in the world than what they're reporting on and repeating over and over and over again.
You think they're just trying to speak to their audience, though?
Well, yeah, of course they are.
So I have something I want to read to you. It's important for our listeners to know that we recorded the interview with Frankie a while back, and lately we've had some reemergence of the Fairness Doctrine in the media, and a lot of it stems from some of these things that I'm about to read to you. With all the fake news coming out of NBC and the networks, at what point is it appropriate to challenge their license? Bad for country. So, who do you think that was?
Donald Trump?
President Donald Trump. That's right. So, fake news. Should we even broach that? Should we even broach fake news?
Yeah. Let's talk about fake news.
Okay.
We know, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners know, what fake news is. Anybody that's been on theonion.com knows what fake news is. And that sort of infotainment, it was something that we joked about. We watched it, we went there, we shared it, and it was funny. But then it started to bleed over into the real news. it started getting difficult to discern which was fake news and which was real news, especially when some news outlets start telling stories from the Onion.
Yeah. Well, and to refer to it as fake news is somewhat alarming, I think. You got to wonder if there's anything else going on in the terminology and what that's doing. And I guess we shouldn't really speak to that on here, but I will speak to something that kind of scares me. That is when the President of the United States, in his tweet, he mentioned challenging the license of the broadcasters and the networks. Of course, first of all, we know from our interview that there's no way to enforce such a thing anymore. It's just too massive and too big, unless the people did that.
So I read some of those tweets, and what I believe President Trump is actually referring to is the equal time rule, not the Fairness Doctrine.
Can you elaborate on the difference?
So according to uslegal.com, the equal time doctrine states that U.S. broadcast stations permitting political candidates for public office to use the facility for broadcasting must also give an equal opportunity to all other candidates for the office. Equal time doctrine is also known as the equal time rule. So something else I found interesting from Frankie's interview was that the fight against the repeal was actually a bipartisan issue. So both sides of the aisle, there was a collective agreement that the Fairness Doctrine should stay. In the 80s, when they were talking about repealing the Fairness Doctrine, Congress had pushed through a law to keep the Fairness Doctrine, to actually make it a law instead of just a codification. And when it got to President Reagan's desk, he vetoed the law.
Yeah, I think it stemmed a lot from the fear that someone's voice was going to get drowned out if they did that. And the fact that some of the names that she mentioned were actually people who have benefited largely from that. I know she said Newt Gingrich, and I know I see him on the news all the time on networks that have emerged. So it's just interesting. These sides both opposed it, but it got pushed through anyway. And you really should look up her paper and read that because she talks quite a deal about the fight that went on. I think it's important to understand that, at least from what I've learned from this, is that we have to have more accountability for everything and everyone involved. And I think something that Frankie had touched on or spoke to was that one of the ways to do that is to ask for higher journalistic integrity, to better educate up-and-coming journalists. And that's honestly, I think going to be the key is for them to demand better journalism, for us to demand better journalism. And I think that might save the whole concept of media.
I agree with you. We need to hold each other accountable. I mean, we as the American public need to do our due diligence in being more informed. If we're not going to get it from mainstream media, if we're not going to get it from our preferred news outlets, if we're not going to get the whole story from them, we need to do our own research. I mean, if we really care, and we should all care about these things of public interest that are happening all around us, all around the world, we need to do our research. We need to become more informed citizens.
Look, we've only scratched the surface of the Fairness Doctrine, and that is only a tiny piece of the history of the media of our country. And there's so much more to learn.
If you'd like to hear more from Frankie, follow her on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is @JFClogston. That's @JFClogston. We'll also put a link to it on our show notes and our website. We'd like to give a special thanks to Stu Art and Design for our show's logo, and to Kiko's Last Smile for the music you've heard during the show.
We would also like to thank our guests for their time and insight, and thank you, our listeners. Without you, this isn't possible.
Show your support by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/civilDissonance, and head over to our website for a full listing of our episodes, transcripts, and more information about our guests and other supporters.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. Links are in the show notes and on our website.
And if you're so inclined, leave us a review on iTunes. And if you like what you've heard, tell people about us. I'm Christopher Nottingham.
And I'm Victor Polino, and you've been listening to Civil Dissonance, a Pro Thoughts production.
Now go out and start a conversation. That's pretty good.
That was pretty good.